Hello everyone. It's yet another Creative Outlet Gaming Birthday Extravaganza podcast intro here. So we're going to be doing today one of the episodes that I was the most excited to do. In fact, it was the very first one I did. That's how excited I was for it. Because this year, 2021, is the 30th anniversary of the Super Nintendo Entertainment System, which, if you'll recall, going all the way back to episode number 1, that was the very first system that I ever played. I'm in college now. My father had a Super Nintendo when he was in college, so, I was born not too long after he had graduated. I would say, I think it was 5 years later, but that's really not that important. He still had that around, and that was where I would play a bunch of games. So I'm really excited to get in today and tell you all the typical pre-recorded topics that I have, but I also want to talk about some newsy items about the SNES. And in fact, they all kind of follow a theme that I noted, not to spoil my own podcast here, but when I talk about the futures of the future of the SNES, the big thing that I said is it's really not so much in official hands, it's in fan-made hands. So I have a few stories here focused on the SNES, whether it's about games, the system itself, teams, that a lot of folks in the community are working to improve the SNES, improve games, get games re-released that I want to tell you about. So, for example, the first story I have here pulled up on good old Nintendo Life is does it really? Where does it say who is doing this? Where is it? Here it is. Vitor Vilela. In fact, I don't think this is the only time that he gets mentioned. According to this article, he's fixing what is considered one of the biggest weaknesses of the SNES now. I don't know how true this is for me, because I don't think I own actually, no, I do own one of these games. But the SNES, like many older pieces of hardware, the NES included actually as well, is that there are plenty of games that are victim to slowdown. And one such game on here that I own is Super Mario World. Now, I can't recall where exactly the slowdown occurs in Super Mario World, but there is a video linked here particularly for this Project Fast ROM that Vilela is doing, focused on Super Castlevania 4. And apparently there's a stage in Super Castlevania 4, it's a pretty famous one, where Simon Belmont is traversing along this bridge that is getting destroyed, and the whole background is just rotating like a cylinder. I don't know the exact stage, but that stage in particular is victim to a lot of slowdown because the CPU in the SNES is at 3.58 megahertz, right? So a lot of games wouldn't exactly reach that because they're using intense hardware, or they're using intense effects, right? So the CPU just couldn't keep up with the things that are happening on screen, hence the slowdown. So they would go to like 2 point something megahertz. In fact, it cites here for Super Castlevania 4, it's 2.68 megahertz, even though the SNES should be able to do 3.58 megahertz. This is technical stuff that is above my pay grade to understand. But one way that Nintendo would get around this was with a technology that they just didn't have available for these games, just because they hadn't made the chip yet, called the SA1 chip, in long form called the Super Accelerator 1 chip, which had a separate processor, not unlike the Super FX chip, how it's basically another processor in the cartridge to do its 3D models that you see in like Star Fox and Stunt Race FX. But the SA1 greatly increased the processing speed of the SNES to blazing 10.74 megahertz, as well as some other technical capabilities. Faster RAM, apparently, is one of the big ones in there. So suppose, right, if you were able to, that you could go back and just pop this chip in an SNES cartridge for a game that runs pretty slowly, well, yeah, the game's going to run at the speed that it should be running at. And so now we have SNES games that are running constantly at their proper speed. And I think that is a fantastic change. Like I said, I don't have a ton of games that could benefit from this. The only one that I see listed is Super Mario World, so I'd be interested. Again, I don't know the areas where Super Mario World really slows down, but if those are pointed out, I would love to see a comparison between these. And hey, I would love to have a Super Mario World Definitive Edition with fast ROM enhancements in there to really make the game be everything that I want it to be. Similarly, Vilela has been working on adding widescreen support to Super Mario World, which I think is pretty darn neat. So, it doesn't do much on the map, but as you can imagine in-game, that makes a world of difference. You can see so much further ahead. It's really, I feel like I never really had too many visibility issues in playing Super Mario World, but seeing what is this level that's in the Twitter video it has here? Butterbridge 1 is the stage. Seeing that in widescreen completely changes the game. I can only imagine like what the opposite experience would be like. What would it be like playing a game like New Super Mario Bros. Wii in 4x3 only? I think you can do that. In fact, I'm certain that's an option on the Wiis to play in 4x3, but it would be very weird doing that, right? What would New Super Mario Bros. U, which was made in widescreen only, be like shrunk to 4x3? That would probably make the game way harder, but, making Super Mario World be in 16:9 widescreen, not really necessary, but it certainly would make the game a lot easier and be more in line with its successors, its new super brethren, so to speak. And I appreciate it. Again, I love seeing... I talked about this, I think, in the Zelda intro. I love seeing enhancements to old games, to see new ways that they can be improved. Now, and again, with some very rare and minor exceptions like the Slippy mod, again, I understand, I don't want to beat a dead horse there. It's good as far as I'm concerned, just for personal use, but I understand... I can see where Nintendo takes their legal position, even if it isn't necessarily an ethically correct position. But Vilela is not the only person working on these sorts of things. In fact, the team that made the SNES title, or at least just some of the members of the SNES game Terra Enigma, perhaps much more famous as a Super Famicom game and a European SNES game, one that never came out in the West, one of the Enix RPGs, wants to see a re-release of Terra Enigma, and I think that would be a fantastic thing. And like I said, it's one of the only games in this, or rather, the Quintet trilogy. We got in North America Illusion of Gaia and Soul Blazer, just not Terra Enigma. I don't think there's actually any formal connections between these games, but this is a game that members of the team are looking to see a revival of, and I think that would be fantastic. It could be a very new experience for someone like me who's never played it, who doesn't play a ton of RPGs, but I've just heard really good things about it. Let's see. As far as other hacks, there is the hacker Mr. L314, so Mr. L314, who has restored the track editor for Super Mario Kart. So you can literally, on the SNES, in this effectively a program, the SFX DOS OS made on the SNES, basically turning the Super Nintendo into a PC, according to this little quote here. You can just build tracks for Super Mario Kart in the game, on console, which is genius. I mean, what better piece of hardware to build your game tools for than the thing that you're going to be running the final game on, right? Now, kind of like Super Mario Maker, apparently there's some other level editors in the game. I don't know exactly. That's all that the article says by Liam Doolin here, but you can make Super Mario Kart tracks, and that's pretty neat. I'm certain there are mods and fan games of Super Mario Kart out there with original track designs, but I would be really curious to see what sorts of new things can be made directly on the SNES to see what, how can you reimagine the tools used to make a level like Donut Plains 3 or Mario Circuit 2 or Rainbow Road and turned into these new weird creations that just give Super Mario Kart a little bit more of a revitalization, so to speak. As far as other news, there is that news that unfortunately one of the developers behind BSNES, actually no, I think it's a sole developer going by the name of Nier, has unfortunately, where is it here? This is a non-binary individual. I did not read into the article far enough, my apologies. He was a victim of some bullying, some harassment, as you can imagine. Like I said, he was a non-binary individual that is one of many still existing marginalized groups on the planet. I have not read far enough here to see if what the cause of death was, whether it was suicide or any sort of thing. But regardless, it appears that this individual has passed away. Now, I don't know a ton about emulators, but it appears that... Okay, no, I can't read. Apparently, right at the top here, it says that this... developer has taken their own life, and that's just a shame. Not only because, of course, he was a brilliant person making considered one of the premier emulators. I've not used it, but I understand the impact that emulate devices have. In fact, I've used other emulators, particularly DS emulators, for my own personal purposes, so I know the value that they can hold. And it's just a shame to see someone who is so passionate, who wanted to push whatever the Super Nintendo could do, just end up killing themselves because some people just can't accept whatever identity this person chose to live their life as. And, I there's just a ton of tweets listed in this article, statements, comments. Even the folks on the CU podcast talked about Nier's passing here. So I just, my heart goes out to whoever the folks around him, whoever he touched personally, whoever he touched through his emulator, so to speak. And it's just a shame that that's another person that's not going to be able to walk this earth again. I suppose that is a bit of a sad way to transition into the main topics. I think there was one other thing I wanted to cover here, but I don't think it's super important. It's basically, it's just a little thing that the individual who designed the North American version of the NES and the SNES has retired from Nintendo. One Lance Barr, so the SNES we got is thanks to him. All sorts of interesting, I guess it's all sorts of good creative SNES news here at the start, but a little bit of sad things as far as retirement and just the worst thing in the world, suicide and death for folks. So, but we are here, even regardless of these sad things, to celebrate the continued life of the Super Nintendo Entertainment System. It is what I think these folks would want us to do, since they clearly had passion for the projects that they worked on. So let us have a little talk about the SNES as pre-recorded by myself. As always, we're going to talk about an overview of the hardware, as well as many of the pieces of software that I was excited to play as a child. We're going to talk about what the future of the SNES could look like. I already kind of outlined it here in these news articles. That is clearly mostly fan work. And we have a little bit of a special topic, like we have in every single episode of the Creative Outlet Gaming Birthday Extravaganza series. Yet for whatever reason, apparently I am struggling to remember what it is. So let me pull up my list. Yes, here it is. I've had an issue with the retro revival that's kind of happened over the years, which is it seemed in my perception, that you had an 8-bit retro revival with your Mega Man 9s and 10s and your Shovel Knights and all those games. And now there's like a Nintendo 64, PlayStation, GameCube, and Dreamcast era revival with games like A Hat in Time and even Super Mario Odyssey to an extent. So where the heck was the 16-bit retro revival? I posit this question in our special topic, and I come to an interesting bit of a conclusion on that, and that maybe there kind of was one, there kind of wasn't one, but it doesn't entirely matter. But I'll leave you to figure out why, or listen to why that is as we transition into the original recording bits for this episode. So that's all I have for you today. Again, good news, bad news, but ultimately we're here to celebrate the Super Nintendo Entertainment System turning 30 years old, at least for those of us in North America. So please enjoy this little bit that I've already had recorded for you, folks. Alright, so one of the best pieces of advice that I got when I was in school and worked on giving presentations and the like was to always assume that your audience knows nothing, even if we're talking about an audience that probably really, really cares about the thing that you're talking about. And, I mean, I say that because I assume that the folks who would be listening to this probably have a pretty good idea of how and what is and how it came to be. That it being the SNES or the Super Nintendo. I'm just going to kind of interchangeably call them between those. I, in colloquial speech, use the term Super Nintendo because that's just kind of what it was called to me when I was a child. But the SNES is kind of a more officially sort of name for it. But I think it's always good to brush up on the history when we're talking about something like this where you're celebrating the history of it, and in my case, getting all into costume for it, going with the Ness Earthbound hat, and I don't know how well you can see it, but representing with the Donkey Kong Country 3 shirt. So I just kind of want to start with a bit of a historical overview here of how this first system I was introduced on came to be. So let us turn back the clock to 1983, which sounds a little weird because the SNES here we're celebrating came out in 1991, a good 8 years later. But we need to go back to 1983, specifically in Japan, because that's where, what we know in North America and Europe, or I guess the West, saw the NES release in 1985 in North America and 1986 for Europe. So I guess happy 35th anniversary to the European NES as well. But 1983 is when the original version of both of those released in Japan, the Famicom, or the Family Computer, if you want to use the whole name for it. But not too long after that, you can imagine that if a new smartphone needs to come out every single year in the modern day, that other technological companies in the past were already working on creating better, newer hardware than what the 1983 Famicom could do. And after all, the NES was just this mere 8-bit system, so it was time to move on to what would be better than 8-bit. Would it be 12 bits? No. Would it be, well, I guess that's the only variable of 4 in between them. It would end up being 16-bit. So we would see companies like NEC, who is very much not in the console market anymore, make what we know in the West as the TurboGrafx-16 in 1989. But in 1987, they would start with the Japanese version as the PC Engine. And then, of course, when we're talking about the 16-bit era, we have to talk about Sega. So their 16-bit console in Japan and Europe was known as the Sega Mega Drive, and that came out in 1988, and then in Europe in 1990. Us in the Americas got it in between in 1989, but for us, because for some reason the term Mega Drive was copyrighted by some other company, so we had to call it instead the Sega Genesis, which, if you ask me, is a little bit more iconic, but that's probably just some like bias of being in the place where it was called the Genesis, which of course means if you're Nintendo and you still haven't released a 16-bit console and you're still using the 8-bit NES, you should be really working on that inevitable 16-bit system of your own. I mean, granted, along the way, it wasn't like they were completely not making any new hardware. There was the Game Boy in between, which effectively created the original, well, I shouldn't say that. It created the cartridge-based, perhaps, handheld console market. But the NES was quickly becoming less and less relevant because, I mean, it's less powerful. You can't do things quite as amazing on an 8-bit piece of hardware compared to, these new 16-bit pieces of hardware. So they're going to start losing their market. And of course, that's exactly why it was time that Nintendo decided to move on to a 16-bit console, because they were losing their dominance over the market. They can't maintain that lead with this aging hardware. And so development began on what would end up being called the Super Famicom in the late 80s. We're talking about like 89, 88, 89, that sort of time. And of course, it was the final major 16-bit console to release in the year 1990 in Japan. And then Europeans would have to wait the longest. They'd have to wait until 1992 to receive the we call it the Super Nintendo Entertainment System PAL version. It quite literally says PAL version on every box, game, and cartridge. So it kind of just sticks out that it's the PAL version. Whereas us, North Americans, received this boxy but still fine piece of hardware in 1991, August of 91. So just 9 years before I would also come into this world. And so here it is. Here I am. And, that's kind of one of the issues, I guess, of doing this pre-planned fall series of anniversary topics, is that not everything gets released in the same year. So, it's too late now for me to celebrate the 30th anniversary of the Super Famicom, because that was last year. That was 2020. Ugh. And then for my European listeners, it's like I'm pulling the trigger a little too early, because for them, the Super Nintendo is synonymous with 1992, not 1991, so it'd make more sense to talk about it in 2022, but not 2021. So, but, I here, and I'm an American, so I'm going to talk about it in 2021, because console came out in 1991 here. And, I mean, the SNES, people think about consoles typically lasting 5 years, and I mean, the majority of their life is that first 5 years. It's changing a little bit, but even in the past, consoles really still stayed on the market a little longer than 5 years, even if they weren't all that relevant any longer. And that's true here for the Super Nintendo too. It stayed on the market until 1999 here in the West. But the Super Famicom, I tell you, that is one of the consoles that would not die, because it lasted 13 years, with production being discontinued in 2003. So it's kind of crazy to me to think that there were effectively Super Nintendos, but they were Super Famicoms being made after I was born, because you would think that with it coming out in 1991 that you wouldn't see any anymore. And obviously that alone is impressive by itself, but it's even more impressive when you think about how the Nintendo 64, that was the successor to the SNES, released in 1996, and it only stayed on the market until 2002, so you still had Super Famicoms being made after no more Nintendo 64s were being made, which sounds wild to me. And from here on out, my goal is to focus here on this version, this boxy North American SNES, and it launched with 5 games, all of which that I think people consider classics today. I have 3 of them. The 2 that I don't have are, did I say 5 games? I think. Oh no, yeah. 5 games. There's 1 third-party title and 4 first-party titles-ish. The 2 I don't have are Konami's Gradius 3. Not because it's a bad game. I've never played a Gradius, and I'm not a super big shoot-'em-up person. There's the SNES version of Simcity, which is a kind of first-party-ish game, because it's still based on Maxis and EA's Simcity, but it was developed by HAL Laboratory and published by Nintendo, so it's kind of in this weird gray zone of being the first party-ish SimCity. And then, of course, there's the 3 that I do have, which are Pilot Wings, F-Zero, and The best 2D Mario game, hands down, bar none. No debate necessary. Super Mario World. And I think I'm getting close to being ready to talk about my story here with the Super Nintendo, but you can't talk the 16-bit era without going on a tangent about the console war. Now, if you think about today, in 2021, Nintendo isn't really included in the console war. In fact, today you only really see people battling about if the PS5 or the Xbox Series X is the superior console. I don't know neither of them, but then again, that's really most people, because it's so hard to get one nowadays, even if they just launched in November. But, I'm largely of the opinion that if you're arguing about which box you spent $300 to $500 on is better, you're really just contributing to a huge waste of time. And I did a whole segment on here in the past, rounding up this 9th generation of consoles between the PlayStation 5, the Xbox Series X, and of course the Nintendo Switch, and describing how they all have unique strengths. They all have some way that their manufacturer should take advantage of them. So, I don't really have a stake in the game. I know why each one is valuable, and I could, I already have one of those 3, but I could be reasonably persuaded into also owning one of the other 2 because they have a specific advantage that makes it unique. And like I said, I know what I prefer because I already have it, and granted, it is also the cheapest, so it's the easiest to get. But like I said, the Series X and the PlayStation 5 also have their own unique advantages. I don't even want to talk about the PC Master Race business because, PC is like a whole rabbit hole in itself, and I just have this potato here, which is fine for me, but I'm probably going to have to get something better in the near future. I don't know how near that future is. But we're going to get off of that tangent and talk about the old school, the 16-bit console war in the early 90s. This is before you even had Sony and Microsoft even thinking of entering the market. I guess Microsoft was technically in it with their PC games, but Sony wasn't quite there yet as far as making hardware. And they were close. They were going to enter a generation later and then claim dominance for good reason. But in the 16-bit era here, we're talking Sega and Nintendo. And normally when you think of console wars, maybe this is just me. I think about kids on the playground and nowadays ridiculous people on the internet with too much free time arguing about how they spent their money better. And I guess I'm hoping that today, with the advent of cross-play and how similar consoles are getting to each other, that maybe this is going to subside a little bit. I don't know. But I digress. But where the SNES versus Genesis console war is different from these, cultural wars of the past is it wasn't just these random people out in the world fighting each other with words. It was the actual 2 companies throwing punches and haymakers at each other, right? And that was going on through most of the era for each of these consoles. And you look at the Genesis, it was the cool console. It was for us older people, because it had a lot more sports games, which are things that if you were a teenager, you probably cared about sports games a little bit more than the potentially cutesier games that you might see in the SNES. And it kept titles like the obvious one is Mortal Kombat, uncensored with all of the blood, with a code. While, the wimpy SNES, you were not even allowed to have blood on the Super Nintendo version of Mortal Kombat. And it showed because the Genesis version outsold the Super Nintendo version by triple. So the blood was kind of important to people for that game. But then for comparison, if you had the SNES, you had access to all of the first-party Nintendo games, which is basically the main reason that most people get the Nintendo consoles today, is because they want to play the first-party games, right? If you wanted to play Super Mario World, which, as a reminder, is the best 2D Mario game, hands down, bar none, no debate necessary, you had to have the SNES. But to be fair, this was an era where it wasn't just that the first-party games were the thing that the SNES had up their sleeve. They actually still had many exclusive third-party games. You're talking your Konami games with stuff like, I already mentioned Gradius 3. There was also like Super Castlevania 4, The Legend of the Mystical Ninja. Those are some Konami games. There's the original Mega Man X trilogy, if you want to talk Capcom, Final Fight. And then, then there's even Square as well with Final Fantasy 3 and 6, and mostly Final Fantasy, but I'm sure they did other stuff too. And then, kind of circling back to Capcom here, it's kind of hard to talk about the SNES without mentioning that it kind of sort of had the first home conversion of Street Fighter II, which is the game that made fighting games like a big mainstay genre across the world. So it's kind of hard to beat. And that isn't to say that Sega was gonna just keep take that fight sitting down, because they still were able to come back with some 1-2 punches, because they also went ahead and decided, all right, maybe the Super Nintendo has better hardware because it came out 2 to 3 years later, depending on where you were in the world. But we can do better because we can make add-ons which make the system better. And those, in the case of Sega, they made 2 add-ons. The Sega CD, otherwise known as the Mega CD in other parts of the world, because it was still the Mega Drive in other parts of the world. And there was the 32X, but those 2 failed hard for a couple of reasons. First, of course, you had to already have a Sega Genesis to even use either of those 2 add-ons, which severely limited their audience. So, of course, if you're a developer, you probably don't want to put all of your resources into making a game specifically for the Sega CD or for the 32X, because you'd rather sell to the whole Sega Genesis audience rather than, let's sell to this percentage of the larger Genesis audience that just so happens to own the 32X. And not to mention, when we're talking about the Sega CD games, a lot of them were FMV games, which, not to completely besmirch a genre, but they're usually not all that great. And then, if you're lucky, maybe a Sega CD game could be an enhanced version of a game already on the Genesis. I don't know. I don't think I have it anymore. We're gonna go through the games I have. That I own on the SNES here. But I don't think I have this one anymore. But we used to have, I think it was Pitfall, the Mayan Adventure on the SNES, and there was a version of that on the Sega Genesis, but there was also a version of the Sega CD, and the main big difference with that, of course, was the Red Book audio. But is that really a big enough difference from the other versions to justify also having a Sega CD on top of it? And then the latter is true for the 32X as well, is that, you'd have, if you were lucky, you might get some enhanced games for it. And then, of course, there were the Sega CD 32X games that required you to own both the 32X and the Sega CD, if you're already talking about limiting to the portion of the audience that owns the Sega CD, or you're limiting to the audience that owns the 32X, now just imagine you have to cater to that teeny, weeny, tiny overlap between the 2. And then, of course, we can't talk about add-ons without talking about the prices. So the Sega CD cost $299 at launch. And just for context, that might sound like, that doesn't sound too entirely unreasonable. After all, you gotta look at things like how much the PlayStation VR is. Well, the Genesis itself was $189. You have an add-on that costs more than the main console. And then the 32X launched at, a more reasonable $169, so at least it cost less than the Genesis. And it quickly fell from there because the Genesis was already on its last legs, and the 32X was its very, very last hurrah. So, if you were that poor sap who bought all of those pieces of hardware at launch, you would have paid $657 before taxes, which is a lot of money. And again, that already sounds like a lot, but in 2021 dollars, that's $1,100. So that's a lot of money to pay for 3 pieces of hardware with only one that gives you a lot of value, and the other 2 maybe giving you some value if you're really, really going to spend all of the money on that collection. It's not like Nintendo wasn't they were prepared to make this mistake too, and I mean, they still ended up making a mistake either way, because they wanted to make a CD add-on here for the Super Nintendo, but ironically, not releasing that SNES CD was just as much of a mistake, because the company that Nintendo was going to partner with to make the CD add-on was Sony, and they're going to make this add-on for the SNES called the PlayStation. And so essentially, the long story short of that is you might not have PlayStation at all today if Nintendo just stuck with Sony. Although, like I said, the Nintendo PlayStation, which is a very wrong phrase if you ask me, is a whole bigger story that if I'm feeling particularly historical in an episode, I might talk about one day. But it was still worth addressing it in brief here. I cannot get over the irony. It's like, if you just stuck with Sony, you wouldn't have effectively made the best-selling console brand that isn't your own console brand. And even still, it's not like Nintendo also didn't do any hardware innovation that console warriors back in the day used in their arguments for why the Super Nintendo was better, because built into the SNES was this Mode 7 technology. So this is like a particular mode that the SNES could go in that allowed its sprites to be twisted around and stretched and flattened, which allowed games like two of those launch titles, F-Zero and Pilot Wings, to be possible. You could see games like that on the Genesis, but it would be more challenging to do that sort of effect than it would be to do on the SNES. And then later games like Star Fox, which is one we're going to talk about here, used the Super FX chip. So that was an add-on for certain games that allowed the SNES to render a very primitive 3D models. And when I'm talking primitive, I'm talking like more or less wireframe models with colors in between. I mean, I guess that's not entirely fair. There's some games like Stunt Race FX that use it a little bit more effectively than that. And obviously, if Nintendo wanted to, they could have made the Super FX like an actual additional piece of hardware for the SNES. But simply making it a chip that would go into the cartridges, I mean, I don't know, maybe I should, I'm not sure how much of the credit for the Super FX needs to go to Argonaut Games, since they were really the developer behind Star Fox. But I digress. Making the Super FX be just a chip that goes in the cartridges is not only a lot easier, it's a lot cheaper, because obviously if you only need the one additional chip, it doesn't pay to make a whole separate piece of hardware, and then it also means that, unlike with say the 32X, now the Super FX games are playable by the whole SNES owning market. So you weren't limiting the sales of Star Fox or the sales of Stunt Race FX or of, I don't know, Yoshi's Island uses it. You weren't limiting it to, limiting those games to just the Super FX owning market, because everyone had a Super FX chip in their games. And then I guess along the way there's also the Super FX chip 2, which, that was the Yoshi's Island chip. And it was also in games like Winter Gold, which is the rare European-only game. And I mean, there's plenty of other add-ons here that I can discuss and talk about, but I feel like I've gone on enough of a tangent here on like add-ons. Really, the point that I wanted to make here in talking about the console wars is merely that Sega and Nintendo themselves felt like they had to get into the fight to show people that our system is better, and you should really get yours. And I'm saying in a different way from just marketing that you have the better system, because obviously as a company your goal is to make profit and therefore prove that you have the better system. So at this point, that I've gone over just kind of the informationally bits, it's time to get a little bit more improvisational, because we're going to talk about my own experiences with the SNES, just talking about all of the games. And I planned on going in alphabetical order here, but I figure it's only appropriate that we start with the best 2D Mario game of all time, hands down, no questions asked, no debate necessary. I said that wrong, even though I've written it down like twice. We're going to talk Super Mario World. Now, I remember talking in the first episode here about... Now, I keep dropping it. What were some of my first games? And, of course, 2 of the 3 I mentioned were Donkey Kong Country and Super Mario World. I mean, and I've been calling it the best 2D Mario game, hands down. No debate necessary. Why can't I remember the middle part of this little diatribe? And there's a reason for it. And for me, it all comes down to control. People talk about, well, which one's better, Super Mario Bros. 3 and Super Mario World? And for whatever reason, people seem to think Mario 3 is better, and I'm just going to put it out there, they're wrong. Because Super Mario Bros. 3, in my opinion, controls horribly. To me, it's just too loose of a game, where I cannot feel confident in most of my jumps. But Super Mario World has, like, the tightest possible jumping controls out there, where if I feel like I can make a jump, I will make that jump without any problem. Now, to be fair, I mean, I guess having the cape feather in the game helps a lot. And it blows the Tanuki leaf out and the Tanuki suit out of the water, because with the cape feather you can just hold down the jump button, whereas with the raccoon leaf and the Tanuki suit you have to constantly tap the button to try to slow your descent periodically. But I digress. I don't want to completely turn this into a dunking on Super Mario Bros. 3 session here and talk about Super Mario World. There's a lot of other things that the game did well that aren't just it being superior to Mario 3. Of course, it added Yoshi, which was, a type of character that the developers had wanted to include all the way back in the original Super Mario Brothers, but they just couldn't do it at the time. The hardware wasn't quite there, which I somewhat call, as a Pat's been saying lately in the CU podcast, I call Bravo Sierra on, because even the little like educational games were able to include, or like the Mario's Missing had Luigi riding Yoshi. But granted, I mean, I guess I don't know if that's so fair of a comparison, because those came out in the late 80s, early 90s, where Super Mario Brothers was 1985. They probably weren't the full extent of the NES's capabilities weren't visible, or weren't easily, why can't I think of a good way to say this? They weren't easily realized in 85, even if it had been out for 2 years, the original Famicom version at least. I suppose one of the great innovations in Mario World was having the game feel connected along the way. There are very few, say, ice levels, because you wouldn't find an ice level in the middle of Donut Plains. You go from Yoshi's Island to Donut Plains, both really grassy worlds, and then you'd go into a cave, and what do you find in a cave? Vanilla Dome. And what's Vanilla Dome all about? Oh yeah, cave levels, and I guess the occasional ice level, because to be fair, it does get really cold in caves. Until eventually going through the bridge levels. Where in Mario 3 you had a single, maybe a couple screens layout of a world. In Mario World, Super Mario World on the SNES, everything would flow together into like one quite literal line that the brothers would travel along on. Let's see, you had, it was the first Mario game with a save feature. That was huge, and if anything, that's the major reason to me why Super Mario World is elevated over all other Mario games, is that you could save it for the first time. You had the addition of fully secret levels and multiple exits for a level, where past games, I guess you technically had secret exits in Mario 3 with things like finding the warp whistle in the first tower of World 1. But I think that's kind of a tenuous secret exit. Whereas in Super Mario World, you would find keys throughout some of the levels that would quite literally have a keyhole somewhere in the level that you could put it in, and lo and behold, now you're going on a different route. The game even signals which levels only have one exit and which ones have two exits or more, which I did not realize when I was a kid, but once someone told me this, I was like, oh my goodness, that makes so much sense. The yellow dot levels are one exit, and the red dot levels have more than one exit. But I digress. It added like the switch palaces. Again, just another way of finding more routes in the same level to ultimately be able to finish it. It added things like the Star Road, which I figure I don't need to put a spoiler for, because I would hope it's common knowledge right already, the existence of the Star Road in Super Mario World. So it was really a game that, to an extent, rewarded you for going for everything. Even though it only had 96 exits instead of 100 exits, so 100% was really 96. I'm not sure where to keep going on Super Mario World. I'm so personally attached to that game that it's hard to be like an objective arbiter of how good of a game it is. It mostly comes down to how good those controls were. If the controls in the game were not what they are, I don't think I would like it as much as I would potentially like that accursed Super Mario Bros. 3. Anyway, from here on out, we're going to actually go in alphabetical order with the games that I own. Starting, let's see, I have a few columns here, or a few stacks, maybe. Stack's probably a better word of games I own. Oh, come on. And some of these, I guess, aren't even technically my games. They're the games that from my father's collection. So some of these really aren't going to be talked about very much, and some of these are going to get talked about extensively. Like, this is one that's probably not going to get talked about much. This is Arkanoid Do It Again, which is, as you can imagine, it's Arkanoid. And if you don't know what Arkanoid is, I would hope you know what Breakout is, because Arkanoid is Breakout, but in space. Or at least it looks like it's in space, so it's kind of the aesthetic of it. And there's some kind of story to it, but it really doesn't make sense. But hey, I mean, all I care about is just Breakout, and it's fun. And that's all I really need from it is fun and Breakout. I haven't played it a ton. I can't really get past much more than the first level, because as much as I love games, I kind of suck at games. Let's see. Oh, here's definitely not my game, but one that I grew up with nonetheless. This is Brunswick World Tournament of Champions, which is would you believe it's a bowling game? That's all I really can say about it. You bowl in it. I don't know, maybe I can kind of talk about my opinions on 2D versus 3D sports games. 2D sports games generally kind of are not that great, and this is no exception. Only because, for whatever reason, back in the day, when developers made sports games, especially ones like this, which kind of go for the arcadey sort of 3-click style, they just had to really speed up that bar that you would use for no apparent reason, and it would really, really irritate me, because that makes the game significantly harder. Now for this next one, I'm pulling out 3, because we're talking about Donkey Kong Country, and Donkey Kong Country 2, and Donkey Kong Country 3, which is what the shirt is for. And when we're talking Donkey Kong Country, I have to be honest here. The only game in this series that I associate with the Super Nintendo is the original. The one Donkey Kong Country #1. And that was because this is actually the only one that I had when I was a kid. When it came to playing Donkey Kong Country 2 and 3, these two games here, I actually played those first on the Game Boy Advance rather than the SNES, even though they came out on the SNES first. So, Donkey Kong Country, man, I quite enjoy this game. If I were looking at things objectively, I would probably call it the weakest of the trilogy, but it kind of has the right to be the weakest, purely because it's the first one. It's a game, of course it's a platformer, kind of like Super Mario World, but it tries to go, it leans a lot heavier into this idea of the bonus room, which is fun, if you ask me, to try to find areas in the level where you can play a little extra micro sort of game in the middle as you're going through the stage, but where Donkey Kong Country 1 kind of fails where Donkey Kong Country 2 and 3 succeed is that Donkey Kong Country 1 hardly signals its bonus areas. So let me give a good example. Actually, let me give a bad example first, I guess. So in the first level in Jungle Hijinks in Congo Jungle, when you get Rambi the Rhino, you're essentially just kind of running along, and eventually you reach a wall that you break it open and there's a bonus room for you to go in. It's probably the easiest one to find. But if you just decided at the wrong time to jump past it, you wouldn't have had any idea there's a bonus room there, now would you? And then there's other instances throughout the game where bonus barrels, they really didn't have a ton of bonus barrels, where like bonus rooms aren't signed very well, and that there's going to be one there. Because a lot of bonus areas are just in walls. And, Donkey Kong Country 2, on the other hand, employed the bonus barrel, like especially marked, that's the word I'm looking for, marked barrel that would say, hey, there's a bonus area here. Whereas Donkey Kong Country 1 would just use the automatic, I can't think of the word, the automatic like shooting, blasting barrels for if they had a barrel out in the wild that would take you to a bonus level. But at the same time, I cannot deny my nostalgia for the original Donkey Kong Country and how I think it's a fantastic game. It's also probably the hardest of the three, if only because Donkey Kong is a much more situational character compared to Diddy Kong. You kind of want to play as Diddy Kong in it, if only to continue going faster. I apologize. I'm probably giving very terrible descriptions of all of these games, but I'm trying to fit in a description of like 23 games into here, so I don't want to go into super big detail about any of them. If anything, there might be a Donkey Kong episode at some point where I talk about all three games in more detail. But if I honestly had to pick which one of the three I actually like the least, it's going to be Donkey Kong Country 2, which most people are probably shocked about that because Donkey Kong Country 2 is considered the fan favorite, and of the original trilogy, my favorite is actually probably Donkey Kong Country 3. I know, blasphemy. And honestly, it's because, for as great as Donkey Kong Country 2 is, it just kind of lacks something for me. I can't quite put my finger on what it is, because, again, there's so much about Donkey Kong Country 2 that it keeps from Donkey Kong Country 1 that's fantastic. Like, they all clearly have similar DNA. But I think where Donkey Kong Country 3 succeeds for me is that it constantly keeps me on my toes, There, like, every level... and I guess this is true of Donkey Kong Country 2 as well. There are very few what I would call generic levels in this original trilogy of games. There are very few levels that just are a jungle level or are, just a water level. They don't have anything unique about them because one of the goals with this game was to make entirely unique levels. You go to Clam City. What do you find in Clam City in Donkey Kong Country 1 for that underwater level? Oh, it's populated with clams that shoot pearls at you. So that's the gimmick of the level. You go to Web Woods in Donkey Kong Country 2. Well, you're going to play as Squitter the Spider in it and shoot webs to create platforms in the woods. Go to Donkey Kong Country 3 here and play, what's a good one? If you play Ripsaw Rage, it's a tree level where you're not only going through giant trees, you're also being chased by a giant saw along the way. And in that sense, all of these levels are memorable, but they're not all perfectly amazing levels. Again, I don't want to, it's hard to improvise talking about games, especially in short versions. Sometimes I wish I had small, tiny collections so I could just go on and on and on and on about the same game, but I also don't want to get super boring. So let's talk about F-Zero, and F-Zero is the next one in this alphabetical list, and it's so sad. this game itself is not sad. This game is actually really, really good. It's sad that the series hasn't had a new game in like 15 plus years. So F-Zero is a futuristic racing game. In fact, probably one, if not the first, one of the first of its kind. And so essentially you take, there are 4 racing machines that you can choose from with characters associated with them, but you don't really get to choose the character. You're not choosing Captain Falcon, you're choosing the Blue Falcon. You're not choosing Dr. Stewart, you're choosing the Golden Fox. And, I mean, it's a racing game. It's just really, really fast. And that's kind of the conceit of the game, is that, it's the first one of the first Mode 7 games. So if you compare, say, Rad Racer to it, it feels like a very different sort of game, because in F-Zero, like, F-Zero looks three-dimensional without actually being three-dimensional. I don't know how to describe it. It's just, well, actually, I guess one of the other conceits of F-Zero 2 is that it's really, really hard. It's not none of the games are really easy, but I would actually contend that the easiest of, like, the 3 console F-Zero games, well, it's kind of a toss-up between the SNES one and F-Zero X, to be honest. I guess my heart wants to go with F-Zero X, but I also feel like I've probably made the most progress in the SNES game, even if it doesn't really save any progress. I think it only really saves best times in the time trial mode. But yeah, I mean, it's a fun game. It's a classic SNES game for a reason, because it's fun to race fast, and I think it'll also be fun to race fast with 3D models in high definition on a giant TV, just kind of saying. And no, I'm not the only one who said it. I know it's not an original thought, but God, we need a new F-Zero game. So let's move on to stack number 2. There's only really 5 games. Oh my goodness. Each of these stacks here that I have planned. Let's talk about Kirby. Kirby isn't a series that I've really talked about very much on here. Kirby Superstar, that's the game in question here. There were a couple of Kirby games on the SNES, and most of them, for whatever reason, came out like at the tail end of the console's life. Kirby Superstar being one of them. And for whatever reason, Kirby Superstar is considered like the quintessential Kirby game. Now, don't get me wrong, I do also quite enjoy the game, but I don't know if I would quite call it my favorite Kirby game. I do firmly believe that for many series, whichever one is the first one you play ends up being everyone's favorite, and for me that's still the first 3DS Kirby game, Triple Deluxe. But I mean, in some ways I also have to give Kirby Superstar credit, because those games wouldn't exist, some of these modern Kirby games wouldn't exist if it weren't for Kirby Superstar, because a lot of their DNA comes directly from this game. It was the first Kirby game to include having copy abilities that do multiple actions depending on how you, which direction you have the D-pad facing and how many times you hit the buttons, whereas like in Kirby's Adventure and Kirby's Dream Land 2, and even many succeeding Kirby games, every copy ability would only do one thing. If you got fire, you would shoot fire breath, and that was it. Well, in Kirby Superstar, if you have the fire ability, you can shoot fire breath if you just hit the attack button once, but you can also dash and turn into a flaming ball and shoot forward. If you have the sword ability, you won't just swing your sword forward, you can also do an uppercut and a downward thrust like Link, to the point where you wear a little hat. This was also the Kirby game that originated the hats for all the copy abilities. And the big conceit with Kirby Superstar is that, I mean, as it says, it's 8 games in one, which is like true, but not at the same time. I mean, a couple of them are really just mini games. There's the arena and the true arena, which is just a boss rush of all the enemies from the other modes. I mean, one of the 8 games in Kirby Superstar is Spring Breeze. But Spring Breeze is just a remake of Kirby's Dream Land on the Game Boy, but now you get to actually use copy abilities in it. And really all that Kirby Superstar does is it takes the base mechanics of Kirby, or in this case, with some of the special bonuses that Superstar allows, and forces you to play each version in a slightly different way. If you're playing Spring Breeze, you're playing traditional Kirby. You're going through 5 levels, getting to the end, beating the bosses. But if you're playing The Revenge of Meta Knight, now instead you're going through one slightly bigger level, but you have to beat it under a certain time limit. If you're playing The Great Cave Offensive, which for me is offensive, because it's basically a Metroidvania, and that's scary, instead of going through different levels, you're going through like 4 giant, again, Metroid-style areas. And I mean, I'm glad I have the SNES version, but part of me really wishes instead I'd gone with the DS version, Kirby Superstar Ultra, because not only does that include the base, it includes all the stuff that's in Kirby Superstar, it also has some of its own unique stuff, and I'm really not prepared to buy Kirby Superstar again, but on the DS. I mean, you know, I guess I shouldn't count that option out, though, because it's not like I haven't bought the same game twice before in a quite more literal fashion, but I don't know, something, for whatever reason, I really have been averse to getting Kirby Superstar Ultra, and really a lot of other DS Kirby games. Like, I don't think I have a single DS Kirby game, which is surprising, because I have a lot of the 3DS Kirby games, as well as the small handful that are out on Switch now. But let's move on to something different. Let's talk Ms. Pac-Man. Now, Ms. Pac-Man probably seems like a weird idea to have as an SNES game, because it came out in like 1982 or 3, the original arcade version. So why would you want your brand new 16-bit console to have a really old arcade game on it? And I'll be honest, I actually haven't been able to play this version of Ms. Pac-Man, because for whatever reason the stupid cartridge won't work. I think I just need to clean off the connectors. I really hope that's all I need to do, because I'd really like to actually play it. But this version, and the Sega Genesis version, to be fair, actually includes some pretty unique features compared to most other versions of Ms. Pac-Man, which, if you're lucky, is a straight arcade conversion. This version is actually 2-player. And I don't mean 2-player in the arcade, like how in the arcade you'd have to switch between players when one of them dies. I mean, you can have 2 Pac-Man, Ms. Pac-Man, and Pac-Man, just Pac-Man, playing on the same map. You can set the speeds. Like, if you're like me and you prefer it being a slower Ms. Pac-Man, you can play the slightly slower Ms. Pac-Man. But if you're like my dad, who loved the really fast Ms. Pac-Man, you can set it to be really fast. And lo and behold, there's a lot of there's a lot of people who, if you ask them which version of Ms. Pac-Man they would recommend, they'd probably go with the Super Nintendo or the Sega Genesis version, if only because of all of this unique customization. It's one of the few times where home conversion is, in some ways, better than the arcade version. Not that the arcade version is bad, but this version is unique in the special abilities it allows you. And then we have NBA Jam. Now, this is actually a sports game that I do have some nostalgia for. Like, if I had to pick if someone were to make me play a sports game, I'd say, could we play NBA Jam, maybe? And it's not even because I love basketball, although if I were to pick a sport that I would willingly watch on television, the one that I would maybe go for is basketball. It's because it takes basketball and makes it not realistic. And that's kind of what I need out of my sports games, is to not, need to know all the intricacies of the game and all the ins and the outs. Here you just have 2 people who will knock each other down and light the basketball net on fire with their flaming basketball because they can throw it really, really hard. And to be fair, I can't say I know the same intricacies with NBA Jam that some other people do. It's not the most nostalgic game for me, but it's a sports game that I grew up playing and actually really liked, which is more than I can say for the Electronic Arts PGA Tour Golf, which is not a bad game, but it's clearly the first EA Sports golf game. It's pre-calling it Tiger Woods PGA Golf. And again, it's certainly not like a bad game, but it's just kind of a golf game. It's a game I have mostly because it's from my parents' original collection, and I mean I still like it, but I can't say that I am commonly clamoring to pop in EA Sports Presents PGA Tour Golf. Moving on, the last game I have in this stack is Space Invaders, which is sadly just Space Invaders. I think it's in color, which is kind of unique. But really the more interesting Space Invaders from this area wasn't the Super Nintendo version, it was the Game Boy version. And not even because it was Space Invaders on the go, but ironically, the reason the Game Boy Space Invaders is interesting is because of the Super Nintendo. Because if you plugged that version into the Super Game Boy, which is one accessory I did not talk about in my discussion here. We'll save that for another day, actually, I guess. You would actually get to play the arcade version of Space Invaders rather than the Game Boy version. That's right. The Game Boy version of Space Invaders is a completely different version of Space Invaders loaded onto it for when you plugged it into the Super to Game Boy on the Super Nintendo. What a world. But kind of like Arkanoid, I don't have a ton to say about Space Invaders because it's Space Invaders. You're a tank shooting at aliens, and if you're really bad at it, like me, or kind of more like a chicken, I guess, you try shooting through the barriers, which basically means you're just killing your own barriers, which is bad strategy. And I think we have one more stack and a half here to go through. Oh, come on. Starting with Star Fox, which I think is one of the few Super FX games I own. I really don't own a ton of Super FX chip games, but this is one of them. I tell ya, I really want to like Star Fox, the Super Nintendo game to be specific, but I can only really like Star Fox 64 and beyond. And first off, because kind of like Super Mario Bros. 3, this game doesn't save, and I would play it more if it's saved. Also, the game kind of plays like a slideshow on the original SNES. I've played it a little bit on the SNES Classic, as well as, a lot of these games, I will admit, I have not booted up their cartridge versions in a while, because they're also available on Switch Online, and it's just a lot easier for me to pull that out than it is to turn on the SNES. But at least I can make a save function in the Switch Online version of Star Fox, and I don't think, if I remember correctly, it plays quite as badly as the original cartridge version, but my goodness, is it slow. And that just kind of makes the levels drag on. Also, and I don't know if it's just me, but my aim is horrible in the SNES Star Fox, whereas if you plop me down in front of Star Fox 64, well, to be fair, more so the 3DS version, because that's the version I own, I would be able to shoot down baddies without any problem. So again, it's a game I want to love, but a game I just can't love, because it's so the first Star Fox for sure. And speaking of Super FX games, let's talk about Stunt Race FX. Now, I've brought this up a couple of times. It's one of the first 3D racing games in the sense that you are going around fully 3D model areas, and in my experience, Stunt Race FX actually renders a lot more smoothly than Star Fox does, and I suppose that's a good thing because this came after Star Fox, and it is a racing game. Racing games are notoriously actually pretty easy games for consoles to handle. I'm not sure why. I think I heard an explanation one time, but I honestly cannot remember. I can't say I have a ton of nostalgia for Stunt Race FX because, again, that's one of those games that I got after the fact. I would say that, at this point, there's only really two more games in this whole group here that are ones that are from my childhood. All the rest are games that I ended up getting after the fact to really round out the SNES collection. I've played the races a little bit, and I'm much better at Stunt Race FX than I am at our next game here, which is also a racing game. I think I'm better at F-Zero than I am at Stunt Race. But Stunt Race definitely still has some of the trappings of the original Super FX chip that make it kind of weak. Primarily that it doesn't render things super duper well. As far as like it, like there are some races that, for example, are in like a cave, or I think it's in like an underwater like tunnel area of some kind, and you're driving along and you're going into the tunnel, and bam, wall. Where'd that wall come from? I was not prepared for that, and oh my gosh, now all of a sudden I'm super behind. And I have turbo here, but I have a limited amount of turbo that I can use up, so now I'm just gonna get behind and end up losing the race because I didn't know that wall was coming. That's the Stunt Race FX experience, in my opinion. But it's still, I don't know if it's better or as good as Super Mario Kart. Super Mario Kart, I tell ya, what a game. It's the first Mario Kart, and man, does it feel like it. It's fun, don't get me wrong. I would argue that Super Mario Kart is leagues better than Mario Kart 64, by a long shot, but it's also not a great game either. You're limited to your 8 characters, and like Mario Kart 64, Super Mario Kart's Achilles heel is its controls. I tell ya, Super Mario Kart is similar in that it's a game I want to love, but it's so hard to love because its controls are just so weak. Specifically the turning. That game is like wide turn central. I just want to go around this tight turn that they have on the map, but now I'm like going all the way off into the grass. And let's not even talk about drifting, because drifting in Super Mario Kart is so similarly, like, I feel like I've got it down better than I used to, but it's still not great. I don't know. And it's also very limited in that, like, most of the tracks use the same aesthetic. If I remember correctly, there's 4 Mario circuits. The only track layout that, or not the layout, but the aesthetic that doesn't repeat is Rainbow Road. There's 2 Vanilla Lakes. There's like similarly 4 Bowser Castles, and it gets pretty samey after a while. Fortunately, all the tracks are unlocked from the outset, so you can very easily go into the Grand Prix and just race. Although it is weird in that Super Mario Kart and Mario Kart 60, no, maybe it's Super Circuit. I know for sure Super Mario Kart and Super Circuit make you come in 4th or better if you want to keep going through the Grand Prix, whereas the other games just kind of let you keep going even if you're failing real hard. Here's another game that I thought I wouldn't have, but I ended up getting as a gift. It's Super Mario RPG. It's the only RPG, actually, that I own on the SNES, which probably sounds a little weird, because there's some people, when they think of the Super Nintendo, and all they think of is RPGs. Chrono Trigger, Final Fantasy, Breath of Fire. Those are all major RPGs. Neither of the Dragon Quests that were on the SNES ended up coming to the West. Neither 5 or 6, but that's a couple more RPGs that are on the system. Actually, when I think of the SNES, I genuinely still think of a lot of the platforming games, if only because I have so many of them. And there's a lot of still cutesy character platformers on the console. But Super Mario RPG kind of bridges that gap. It was called Super Mario RPG, if only because it was the first Super Mario role-playing game. You didn't have Paper Mario yet. You didn't have Mario and Luigi yet, because this game had to set the standards for, well, what are we going to have in a Mario RPG? What's going to is it going to be fully traditional turn-based? No, not quite. Is it going to be an action RPG? No, also not quite. It's going to be turn-based, but you're going to do action-timed attacks along the way, to somewhat simulate that Mario-y feel. When you go around the overworld, you can actually still jump around areas and hit blocks as if it were a plain Jane Mario game, but in an isometric view instead of in a top-down view, or in a traditional 2D Mario view at the time. it's a game that I haven't finished yet. I think the farthest I've gotten is like in the sewers, that sort of area. Again, it's a game I like, but it's not a game that I love in the same way that some people just really, really love Super Mario RPG. But one game that I do love from my child is, of all games, Super Off-Road the Baja. Now, I actually don't know how much relation this game has to the other Super Off-Road games, because this is a little bit of a series. All it really is a truck racing game, and it's fun, it's fast, and that's all I really needed from it. Dang it. That's all I wanted. And it was another one of those games that I played with my dad a bunch when I was a very little kid, and lo and behold, I have a ton of nostalgia for it. But a game that I don't have a lot of nostalgia for, even though it was from our original collection, was Super Tennis. This is a game that I've actually played a lot more on the Switch Online service, and I found that I enjoy it enough. It kind of has the problem, again, of other sports games of that, like, the AI is too good in it. It's too good for my puny human ability to fight it off. It also doesn't help that a lot of 2D tennis games suck in that I always want to see everything from behind, and inevitably it makes me go be in the back, and therefore reverses my movement controls, which is not fun. Wario's Woods is more famous for probably being the last NES game than it is for anything else, and dropping things. And Wario's Woods is just a confusing mess of a puzzle game. It's a game that similarly I want to like, but I just don't understand how to play it. And I guess that actually gets to one of the problems with buying Super Nintendo games in the modern day is it's a lot harder because you don't have the manual to go with it. If you want to learn how to play Wario's Woods, you have to go and watch a video tutorial on the internet, which is fine, but I think it would be a lot more fun if I didn't have to go out and go get additional resources to understand the game. It should be understandable enough without that, if you ask me. But a game that I do find understandable enough without manual and is still a puzzle game is Yoshi's Cookie. Now you would think that Yoshi's Cookie, for being a Yoshi game, would be a first-party game, but no, it's actually in a way kind of a third-party game, because it wasn't actually developed by Nintendo. It was developed by, it looks like, Bulletproof Software, and was ended up licensed by them. And it's a puzzle game where you have a bunch of these cookies all in like a giant stack, and using Mario's levers on the side, you get to get Yoshi to eat them by lining up all the same kind of cookie in a row or a column. And it's simple and it's fun. And again, sometimes that's all you need out of a puzzle game. Now this brings me to my last couple of games, and there's one that I'm realizing that I know I have, but I guess I didn't have it on the shelf there. I'm not sure where it went. We'll talk about that last, I guess. First, let's talk about Yoshi's Island, otherwise known as Super Mario World 2 Yoshi's Island. But even the top of the cartridge calls it Yoshi's Island, because it's just Yoshi's Island. It has nothing to do with Mario. And my first DS game was Yoshi's Island DS. And that's really where I have the bulk of my nostalgia for Yoshi, the Yoshi series. And man, Yoshi's Island is a game that I want to love, and I think is actually kind of easy when you're just kind of going through a casual playthrough of it, but man, Yoshi games are like the ultimate 100% game if you're a masochist. Because there's so much stuff you have to do in a single stage. You have to get your five smiley flowers, you have to get your 20 red coins, and of course you have to also do it without getting hit a single time by any enemy, which is a lot easier said than done, especially in the original Yoshi's Island. It can be a real hard game. Now, fortunately, you do get these items that let you add time to your star timer, because that's essentially your health in the game. You want to have all 30 seconds on the star timer. So it's kind of easier in that sense, but ugh. it's still not a very easy game to get a 100%, which is fine. 100% should be a challenge, but this is one of them. Now, I have one boxed SNES game here. I have hardly played it. It's Pac-Man 2, The New Adventures, which is actually notoriously, apparently, a terrible Pac-Man game. Because it's kind of like a point-and-click adventure where you let Pac-Man just kind of do whatever he wants. And there's a reason I actually still haven't popped it into the console, because I'm not prepared for that. Especially when, again, like so many other games, it doesn't save. Dang companies, just spring for the battery in your game. Now, the game that I just realized that isn't in my stack here is The Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past. I know we have it because I've played it, and again, I much prefer 2D Zelda. I really want to reserve my discussion for it for when I do the Zelda episode, since that's going to be an episode. I didn't really want to reveal the chronology when these are being recorded, but yes, this is being recorded before the Zelda episode. And I like it, but I prefer A Link Between Worlds. I'm just going to leave it at that for now. There's reason it's considered a classic Zelda, and I would argue the far superior classic Zelda compared to all of the others. But that's really not where my SNES collection ends, because we have to talk about some SNES-inspired stuff. Well, actually, no, let's start with these. You might have noticed I don't have any Mega Men on the SNES, but that's because I've got these. And I guess really the classic collection doesn't have a ton of SNES games, because the only SNES Mega Man of the classic series was Mega Man 7. And I haven't even touched it yet because I want to finish the 8-bit games, and right now I'm still in the middle of Mega Man 3. But I have touched the Mega Man X Legacy Collection as far as the original Mega Man X. And I mean, at least all three of the... well, there's 4 games in the first Legacy Collection, and all of those are SNES games. All the rest are... PlayStation 1, a PlayStation, and a couple of PlayStation 2 X games, and that's really where I've played them. I don't really want to do a Mega Man discussion here, because I feel like that fits better in a Mega Man themed episode. But for as much as people like Mega Man X, I am not too impressed yet, and maybe that's just because I'm not very good at it. But I think as I improve with the game, I'll end up liking the Mega Man X series better, for as much as it's a classic SNES series. So that covers my experience with the SNES, and I just made a real big mess here on the floor right next to me. But I'll have to clean that up whenever I'm done recording this. So what comes next for Super Nintendo? It probably seems like a bit of a strange topic, considering that Super Nintendo's been long dead since, like I said, 2003 if you're in Japan, or 1999 here in the West. So really, I'm not expecting much more in the realm of official new Super Nintendo stuff. And that doesn't mean it's not gonna have anything, no new official things happening for it. Because there is still merchandise coming out. I could have an official SNES shirt, but a lot of them are so expensive for whatever reason. And, of course, there's still going to be new games added to the SNES service on Switch Online. I talked about the SNES Classic, and I would love to see more units of those be released, but I figure that ship's sailed since there's no more Wii accessories being released either, and the SNES and NES Classic Editions used the Wii remote connectors for it, so you'd need the controllers for it. But like I said, the official scene for the SNES isn't really the interesting thing. To me, the interesting thing that will be in the Super Nintendo's future is all the unofficial stuff. And there's still games coming out for the SNES, whether it's ROM hacks. There's a ton of Super Mario World ROM hacks. There's a ton of Link to the Past ROM hacks. Now, I can't say a ton about it because I actually haven't done... I don't think I've played a single ROM hack, which is kind of shocking. You'd think that I would want to play a ROM hack of Super Mario World just to have more of that game in my life. And I haven't gotten around to doing something like that. But there's still plenty of famous hacks. Of course, when we're talking Mario World, we have to talk about Kaizo Mario, which is so hard. I'm sure. I have not played it, but I've watched plenty of it, and it looks real hard. There's actually not a lot of Donkey Kong Country ROM hacks, which would be the ones that I'm more interested in. There's like there's this boss blitz one, but that's kind of lame because it's just a boss rush. Which if I wanted to play all the bosses in a row, I would just boot up a 100% save file of a file of Donkey Kong Country that was finished, I should say. I mean, there's ROM hacks like The Legend of Zelda Parallel Worlds. And then there's, of course, the straight-up homebrew games that people make of completely original stuff for the SNES. There's aftermarket accessories, aftermarket consoles, because one day, sadly, this console is going to die on me, and so if I want to continue playing these cartridges, I need something else that'll let me play them. And actually, there's some companies that are even going out and reprinting games. I know IM 8-Bit made new copies of Mega Man X in a special... I want to say it was in a blue cartridge, but I don't remember. I know Mega Man 2, they also reprinted that on the NES, and that had some new cartridges. Of course, you are also going to see things like old stuff getting rediscovered, things that prototypes for games that were originally going to end up coming out on the Super Nintendo, but ended up not coming out. I know last year there was... Cooley Skunk, which is another one of those, like I said, there are actually a lot of platformers on the SNES, but they're all like mascot sort of things that may not be quite as good. And one of those was Cooley Skunk, which ended up turning into Punky Skunk on the original PlayStation. That just happened to be found in January of 2020. I can't say that I've heard a ton of things since then, but I know that that's one that stuck out to me as an SNES game that ended up being unearthed from the prototype purgatory. That's a good phrase, prototype purgatory. But perhaps the most frustrating thing with the future of the SNES is that it really hasn't had much of a legacy, I would argue. You know, in the late 2000s and the early 2010s, especially on digital fronts, you saw the 8-bit retro revival. And nowadays, I would argue there's still 8-bit retro revival games coming out, but now we're kind of moving into the retro 3D PS1 N64 revival. But the 16-bit era, I would argue, was pretty close to skipped over. And maybe I'm being unfair in saying that, because this could just be a personal issue for me, because I would classify a lot of retro revival games that are definitely supposed to be 8-bit games to look a lot more like 16-bit games. Like if you show me a picture of like Shovel Knight or Blaster Master Zero, they look way more like 16-bit games than 8-bit games. If only because like they use way more colors than the NES could make in a single image. They're also there's no sprite flickering, and sprite flickering still happened in SNES games, but it wasn't quite as often as you'd see in an NES game. And that's not to say that there's no games that exist today that are 16-bit inspired. Of course, you look at independent games, like there's Freedom Plant here. That is most definitely a 16-bit inspired game, although I would argue it's more of a Genesis inspired game than it is a Super Nintendo inspired game. Then there's its sequel, which is eschewing for more of a 32-bit aesthetic, coming out when it's done. There's new games, like there's this new game, Kaze and the Wild Masks, that I want to pick up. Not only does it actually look similar to a 16-bit game, it's actually inspired by Donkey Kong Country to the point where you can find bonus rooms all around the place, and you can bet it's going to be in my collection one of these days. Even then, something as simple as Super Mario Maker and Super Mario Maker 2 here, that carried on the legacy of Super Mario World because it's a theme of the game. Dragon Quest XI's, that's another game where you can play it in 2D mode, and you're not playing it in 2D mode inspired by the NES, the Famicom Dragon Quest games, no, it looks 16-bit. And while I would much rather play it in the 3D mode, because that's what I have played it in, you can still play it in 2D if you want. And if I were to ever play it again, it's going to be in the 2D mode, just to see how all is different. Actually, I guess I'm kind of curious if folks consider, say, the RPG Maker games to be 16-bit inspired games. Because if you look at the base RPG Maker aesthetic with like all the knights and the sprites and all that stuff, it just screams 16 bits. Like, I mean, I would count it in that sense, but I think they're a little more up in the air because they certainly don't have 16-bit style music, Super Nintendo or Genesis style, unless, I mean, I'm sure there's someone who would go out of their way to make 16-bit style music, but I haven't seen them. And, you know, there are RPG Maker games, again, that use that 16-bit style aesthetic. I think of, like, there's this newer game, Arafel, which is supposed to be 16-bit inspired. Of course, I played To the Moon last year. That's a fantastic 16-bit looking game, even though it certainly does things that you could not do in the SNES. So I don't know. I don't know. I guess the lesson in talking about the question of whether there was a 16-bit retro revival that I got from writing about this, thinking about it, talking about it, is that I guess I was a little miffed that there wasn't a formal 16-bit retro revival, in that you didn't just see a bunch of 16-bit games come out all at once. But I think instead of that conventional revival, it seems like 16-bit games just continued to come out after the Genesis and Super Nintendo lives were over. And in some ways, I don't know, maybe that's even better than having a brief era of, we're going to have nostalgia for the Super Nintendo and here's a bunch of games and now it's kind of over. So I think that concludes my discussion of the SNES today. So I just want to knock a couple more of these over, and so I can pull it up and inevitably wish a happy birthday to this fine piece of hardware I have sitting next to me. It's 30 years strong, and I hope to see it continue on, even though I know one day these games are just going to have to be played digitally because all the consoles and the cartridges are going to die. So happy 30th anniversary, Super Nintendo. That covers what I had to say today, and normally, like I would in every episode, I'd talk about how long this is going to be, and I don't really know if I'm going to be able to say that. It's a lot more challenging, because later on, when the semester and fall starts, I'm going to have to record an intro, but, you know, at least I've been doing this for about an hour and a half, so please, folks, do all of your engagement typical things, depending on your platform. I look forward to continuing along with the Creative Outlet Birthday Extravaganza, or Gaming Birthday Extravaganza, I mean to say. That was our SNES talk. This is Brandon Pudwell signing out for the Creative Outlet Podcast. Thank you much.